This week we're going to talk about gender and the related ism to considerations of gender, which is sexism. This discussion is going to be a little longer than most of the others we've had so far this semester. And I want to point out to you that while we'll spend some time talking about variations on the binary view of gender that our society largely holds, nonetheless, most of our focus is going to be upon more of a binary view and more specifically in regards to the experiences of women in relation to the issue of gender and how it impacts their daily living. First of all, a very basic concept about gender is that of gender roles, which we studied about in introductory sociology. Gender roles are generalized social roles and expectations for behaving, thinking, and feeling, which are based upon a person's biological sex. We do say based upon biological sex because, generally speaking, when children are born, we begin to raise them with expectations suited to the male or female identification that we give to the child. Individuals as parents may do their best to provide a unisex or non-binary frame around their socialization of their children, but rest assured that the rest of society is going to focus very much upon the visible biological sex, the visible gender of that individual. Stereotypes of gender roles develop and are overgeneralizations about the characteristics of males and females. If you've taken any classes on gender in university, the likelihood is that it has been about women's issues or women's studies. And while that's a very useful course to take both for men and women, I would also encourage you to take a look at gender studies involving men. I've had the opportunity to teach a men and masculinity course a few times, and it's well worth the time taken to look at the issues of gender from male perspectives as well. But again, in a patriarchal society, gender most heavily impacts females. Our gender role stereotypes have a self-perpetuating nature in that we pay attention to and remember most that which fits our stereotypes. The norms that develop from these stereotypes define how a person is to act based upon his or her gender role. There are roles for doing things that are called prescriptive roles, and also about not doing things which are proscriptive in nature. Boys are to be rough and tumble. Boys are to be independent. Boys are not to play with dolls. Boys are not to be interested in things involving hairstyles, for instance. Gender role norms are enforced by significant others in our lives, both at home and in the school environment, at work, on the street, on the playground, and so on. The notion of sexism arises from gender role norms in the same way and can be personal, internalized, or institutional in nature. We experience our gender on both the public and private level. On the public level, our gender includes the things that involve the expectations and norms, prescriptions and proscriptions that are given to us because of our culture and that revolve around our gender. The private level of the experience of gender involves what we call our gender identity. Most professionals believe that when a child reaches a certain cognitive level, somewhere around the time period of 2 to 4 years of age, he or she begins to see the self as either male or female and begins to express and exhibit gender-typed attitudes and behaviors. Many theorists believe that once this gender identity is formed, it's pretty immutable. Now, our culture, as I mentioned earlier, tends to see gender in a binary view, either feminine or masculine, and the two extremes, so to speak, on a continuum are opposite and mutually exclusive. This polarity in view has created gender stereotypes that work to confine males and females to certain roles. Gender roles may help the child to learn how to act, what is expected of the child, but also begin to pressure the child to perhaps deny parts of himself or herself that fit more naturally for that person. Existentialists talk about living an authentic life, and humanistic psychologists will tell you that part of the basis for mental illness and emotional disturbances in our lives is based upon the fact that we are more or less required to give up parts of our authentic selves in order to please others around us. And a lot of this has to do with how we are socialized into our gender. We're coming to recognize gender as a much more complicated concept than the traditional binary view. But still, as I mentioned earlier, much of this discussion is going to focus on the experience of women as the object of sexism in society. But many of these principles can be applied to other gender identities as well. There are those who would say that everything in our lives is based on our gender identity. Most human languages have a distinction between sex groups, male or female gender distinctions, although there are some languages that really don't have male or female personal pronouns. For instance, Finnish is one language that does not have a gendered personal pronoun. And interestingly, Finland had a female president much sooner than many other countries in the world did. And I think that reflects something about the power of both gender identification as well as the power of patriarchy in the world. As you look at the differences between and among genders and within genders, you find more differences within each gender than exist between them. In other words, many men differ from other men, and many women differ from other women more than men and women differ from each other in many respects. There are different views about whether gender traits are natural or are socialized. The essentialist view tends to see gender traits as hardwired into human beings, and so gender change is virtually impossible in the essentialist view and requires a great deal of force to restrain that which comes naturally. Social constructionists, however, believe that we are a product of our participation in perceiving and making sense of our environment. We are actively engaged in our environment. It isn't something necessarily that is just done to us, but it's more of a dialogue between the individual and the environment. So there are no universal truths in the social constructionist view about any innate differences between men and women. The differences that we perceive, they believe, are socially constructed and exist because of a consensual agreement and are reinforced because of that agreement. There's an article from Transgender to Tran, which also talks about how the transgender community itself once focused upon a dual focus to identity in the transgender community, either transvestite or transsexual. Transvestites being essentially a heterosexual who cross-dressed on occasion for fulfillment, whereas the transsexual is a person who transitioned to the other gender through hormone treatments and surgeries, disavowing their assigned gender role. More recently, we've come to see a more complex relationship with gender, even within the transgendered community, is evolved into one that is much more aware of gender complexity, multiplicity, and gender fluidity. It's a continuum and a spectrum of infinite possibilities between our limited cultural concepts of gender and sexuality. Masculinity and femininity, male and female, is much more complicated than we have recognized previously. The author of this article is concerned that the transgender community, though, adopts an approach of assimilationalism and respectability politics, where in essence the focus is upon trying to blend in with the heteronormative culture. The belief being that if people of marginalized groups in the transgendered community act as much as possible like their oppressor, she says, they will be better treated and more easily accepted. The problem with this is that such an approach, while it may make for more comfortable living in the day-to-day world, implicitly and explicitly endorses the notion that the culture of the dominant group is superior, preferable, and universal. That is very much associated with our readings about oppression, and it's something really that is pretty insightful, I believe. Different conflicts that trans people experience are identified here, including such things as making use of their preferred name rather than their legal name, using their preferred personal pronoun. Some individuals, rather than he or she, prefer a they or their when referring to that individual rather than the binary focus on he and she. Access to gender-neutral restrooms is a big political issue. Inclusion in interscholastic and intercollegiate sports teams oftentimes bubbles up in the news. Acceptance in the military has become a social issue thanks to our current president in particular. Access to informed, trans-friendly healthcare and counseling services, that's perhaps more difficult to access than might be imagined. For transgendered individuals being placed in men's unit, for instance, when incarcerated, or in shelters or detention centers, where oftentimes those individuals can be abused. Transgendered individuals experience discrimination and economic marginalization and problems in the employment market, and often are not given the opportunity to experience basic dignity and respect in their everyday lives. And because of that, they're vulnerable to a host of emotional problems, as evidenced here, like any other marginalized populations. Throughout history, What we've been taught about history focuses upon the accomplishments of men, and that's no surprise to anyone listening to this, I believe, particularly white men, and as I mentioned here, in positions of authority. This arises from the patriarchal nature of our society, and indeed the patriarchal nature of most societies around the world. This is something that is consistent throughout recorded history, really through many different cultures around the world, and this vests control, authority, power, influence, and privilege in males, much to the detriment of women. It isn't to say that men don't have problems associated with being in positions of authority. Women may laugh at that or scoff at that, but in fact, oftentimes males experience additional pressures because of the traditional gender role expectations placed upon them to achieve and to be in control and to be strong and powerful at all times. That can be difficult for them as well, but certainly patriarchy has the greatest effect upon women. It is a defining concept of Western civilization that has influenced the lives of nearly every person, no matter the gender, in Western society for the last several thousand years. And I would venture to say this is true in most Eastern societies as well. There is some indications prior to recorded history that a gynocracy may have existed, because a lot of the legends and myths that we know about from ancient history involve deference to goddesses who were believed to be in control of the elements and the fates. But nonetheless, patriarchy has been in charge for most of recorded history. Most recently, the Me Too movement has begun to challenge some of the bastions of patriarchy in American culture and really cultures around the world, but it remains to be seen if this will be a lasting change or a periodic alteration in patterns between men and women until patriarchal control again manages to sweep this movement under the rug. Indeed, there are many individuals who will point to instances where males are attempting to use the Me Too movement to their own advantage. An example being the outcry around the confirmation process of the Supreme Court Justice in 2018, I believe it was, when Kavanaugh was named to the bench. Men use that as an example of males being accused of inappropriate behaviors and sexual abuse of women without adequate proof, and that the Me Too movement is beginning now to victimize males. And so this is something to be aware of for those of you that are interested in this movement. This is perhaps the opening forays of patriarchy trying to get control back as a result of the changes that are occurring in society as a result of the Me Too movement. Gender roles continue to be functional in some respects for getting the essential labor done among individuals at different times in our history and even today perhaps, but who defines who does what is perhaps part of the issue, as in patriarchal society, men are the ones that do all the defining. Institutional sexism interacts with interpersonal sexism to dominate women by both structural and psychological means. So as social workers, when we have female clients, particularly those who belong to other minority groups, it's important to realize how gendered stratification, institutional sexism, and racism interact to place both direct and indirect obstacles in the way of growth for those individuals. Freudian psychology may have been one of the biggest culprits in the 20th century as far as views of women in society and in the mental health field, at least as the foundation, as it says here. This really kind of grew out of Freud's own sociological background. You know, he grew up in Austria in the late 1800s. It was a very repressed society sexually. A lot has been said about the fact that these particular kinds of cultural pressures may have resulted in Freud's views about sex and gender. There's been a lot of criticism of his theories that focusing, for instance, upon how they focus upon the male experience as central to existence, and how women are seen as being envious of men, their physical equipment, that's the reference to penis envy, their placement in society, and so on. Women oftentimes being placed in a bind with these theories if they go about trying to establish and succeed in a career, needing to approach lives in ways that are associated with more traditional masculine socialization because of this particular way of seeing the world. Certainly, Freudian notions of gender have influenced our definition and treatment of mental illness. Women are the ones who are usually referred to as irrational and have been given psychiatric labels that really are associated largely with women. Histrionic personality disorder, for instance, almost always diagnosed for women. And the implication in traditional psychology is that women need men's logical nature to tame them. The classic female disorder, hysteria, has influenced a lot of our views of women. Really, histrionic personality disorder relates to that. 150 years ago, the notion of hysteria was, I think, developed. This is sort of with the development of Freudian psychology, in fact. And there was a period of time, as you likely know, when surgical removal of female reproductive organs through hysterectomies was an answer to the supposed irrationality of women who were upset. Goodness knows why a woman would be upset in the early 1900s. The historical context affects a lot of our views of women, and other things like economics and social demands, labor policy, war, and so on affects that as well. At times when unemployment is high, women are really seen to belong more in the home because the society wants men to be working. When war breaks out, however, in fact, in World War II, there was talk about drafting women to work in factories when the men went overseas because they needed factory workers. And interestingly, as women did this during the Second World War, they became very aware that they were able to function quite successfully without men in their lives. And when men came back from the war and wanted their old jobs back, women didn't want to leave the workforce. And one of the things that happened then was there was a big focus upon the role of absent mothers in creating all sorts of problems with children, like identified here. Women were blamed for the development of schizophrenia, homosexuality, and juvenile delinquency in the lives of their children. The notion was women needed to be home to take care of their children and raise them right. And the point of that was to get women out of the workforce and to get men back into their jobs. Much of the scientific study, really our view of reality coming from science, has a lot to do with how men define the world, because most of the studies that we read about, even those studies about women, are conducted by men. They're designed by men, carried out by men, and written up and concluded by men as well. So we wind up with many theories that are based really on the male perspective. This is one of the mechanisms through which male dominance is passed from one generation to another and from one culture to another. Feminist thinkers believe that it's important that we be aware of the politics of the knowledge makers, the impact of social status on knowledge making, and the effect of disparate power relations. All women are subject to the hierarchies related to gender and are thus affected by oppression. This ranking is what we know as gender stratification, sometimes referred to as sexual stratification, and this is what perpetuates the dominance of the male gender. Some feminist writers would tell you that the feminist consciousness is a consciousness of victimization. In addition to the victimization as females, women of color suffer oppression of both gender and race, and this is where intersectionality comes into play, as well as other minority identifications as well. Sexism and racism are connected so deeply that they're intertwined through at least three methods of social control that are identified here: physical intimidation and threats, domination through economic means, and limitations on the aspiration of women and minorities. Women, as a role, are stereotyped as being largely dependent, childlike, intuitive, irrational, and less capable in scientific efforts and the like. White women generally are stereotyped as relatively frigid. This is an interesting thing when you look back upon how history has treated women in American society. Those of you may remember from your studies of early social welfare history what was called the cult of true womanhood, which was popular in the late 1800s. During this period of time, women were walking around in those big billowy dresses with the tight corsets. In fact, it is said that in Victorian Austria, this is where Sigmund Freud grew up, they would even put curtains around pianos because the legs were believed to be sexual symbols. So there was a great deal of repression of sexuality in the late 1800s, and women in particular were seen as being too advanced to be sexual beings. They were above sexuality. Women who did engage in sex did so only out of a sense of duty to men and to bear children. Women who went to university only went to university basically to find a man to marry. And so the cult of true womanhood elevated women to this status where they were above sex. And this, of course, kind of backed them into a corner. The other interesting aspect of this is there was an outbreak of venereal disease in the early 1900s, of course, brought into the household by men who were dallying with prostitutes. And it was justified because the true woman wasn't really a sexual being per se, and so men had had to go outside of the marital relationship in order to have their needs met. So even when they brought home syphilis and other venereal diseases to their wives, it really was the wives' fault for that. So you see here again, patriarchy gives license to males and blames women for the problems that result. In all of these stereotypes, we lose sight of individual women because we see women through these stereotypes. If white women are seen as frigid, women of color are seen as lustful and overly sexual. And we'll touch on that in a few moments when we talk about some of the issues that women of color have as welfare recipients. Oftentimes, a larger problem can develop from this because, as is often the case with oppressed individuals, women begin to believe the stereotype that develops of themselves. Linnea Glenmay, who's a social worker, teaches at a university in Kansas, has researched and published in areas about sexual assault and empowerment based on social work practice and other sexual minority issues, and believes that all women share the following experiences because of psychological and structural gender oppression. First, a profound alienation from self. Now go back to our discussion of the existential beliefs about authenticity and how we give up parts of ourselves in order to satisfy the expectations, to please the significant others in our lives, and this begins to make sense. She also believes that women share the double bind of either meeting one's own needs or serving the needs of others. Is there a selfishness in wanting to fulfill one's own purpose in life, or should one simply live to serve and take care of other people, which is the traditional female role in American society. And they all share the experience of institutional and structural sexism as a result. In the work world, women are seen as needed only when the traditional male role has failed in a certain area. Otherwise, it's expected that the female will be the homemaker. Paid work is not believed to have the same significance in the lives of women and is seen as conflicting with their primary role as mother and homemaker. And so their income is considered to be secondary to men. Oftentimes, when a man is offered a promotion across the country, the family will pick up and move. But if the woman who may be working is offered a similar promotion, the likelihood is the family will stay put. Women's income is generally considered to be secondary to men. When the woman in a relationship begins to earn more money than the male in the relationship, this often becomes an issue, sadly, in American marriages. So these stereotypes put poor women in particularly vicious double binds. They have to work to support their family, but they're seen as being less than adequate as a parent because they're not home to raise their kids. And their kids, as a result of that, may be beginning to experience some problems with the law or other kinds of issues at home. And when they do work, they work for wages below the poverty line, so it's very difficult for them to provide for their kids. Poor women who reach out to public assistance to help make ends meet are criticized for receiving the benefits, but they also have limited access or restricted access to contraceptive measures and abortions because of the federal rules, for instance, about what Medicaid will and will not pay for. So those who do find work at a reasonable wage have to deal with the inequity of wages. Women still earn roughly 80% of what men earn while working full-time for a year. This is what the Census Bureau tells us, but there's also a study in 2018 by the Institute of Women's Policy Research that shows among those who worked 12 years out of a 15-year period, women earned 49% of what men earned. So there's a great disparity, and poor women really have a very tough life because of the expectations placed upon them to be a good parent and to be a good wage earner. Things like paid family leave, medical leave, affordable child care, maternity leave, all these kinds of things could increase women's labor force participation and also to encourage men to share more of the unpaid time that they spend leaving work to take care of the children, for instance. And yet this is something that is generally not encouraged. If a problem arises in a home where there are two working parents with the child in a school setting, generally speaking, it's the woman who's expected to leave and go tend to that issue. And we tend to believe that we have evolved in our society into an equal shared partnership between men and women in marriage, but really we have a long way to go before we get there. And if you have any doubt about that, I'd encourage you to read an article that was written some years ago by sociologists called The Second Shift, where it talks about what happens when working spouses come home and who does what chores in the household. You know, the old saying goes, Men will work from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done. In the last few decades, we've come to see that poverty is feminized as well. Women are poor because of the effect of these traditional gender roles and their inability to accumulate economic resources because of being squeezed out of the workforce and squeezed out of decent paying jobs that are predictable and dependable. The form of the typical family tends to foster their economic dependence on men and the family itself. The traditional family has the male as the household, and this is supported, as I think we've talked about in other discussions in this course, this is supported by many of the institutions in our society, including religion, the legal system, and education. And as is often the case, there is not a man in the picture because of divorce or never having been married to begin with. The woman's chance of living in poverty are far greater. Governmental institutions, the legal system, also underlie the feminization of poverty. Alimony, for instance, the payment to women following a divorce, has been virtually eliminated. Women may be capable of getting out and finding jobs in the workforce, and yet again, remember, women's income generally are seen as secondary to men's in a family. Women are often expected to defer their own career choices in order to assist the male in pursuit of better employment himself. And so after years of sacrificing her own possibilities and her own capabilities, when the man leaves the relationship, alimony was seen as a way to even the score a little bit and give women an opportunity to get on their feet financially. Child support laws are not adequately enforced, and women who receive public assistance, and because they're not getting child support payments, oftentimes are required to track down and report where the father of the children is to the welfare authorities. Now, there may be reasons why the woman doesn't want to do that, including situations where the woman has left an abusive relationship, and when the welfare authorities contact that male to reimburse them for the public assistance the mother is getting for the children, sometimes that male then tracks down the ex-wife. The job retraining benefits are often very poor, allowing for education or training. At one time, the welfare to work programs and public assistance allowed women to pursue college education as a part of their training requirements, but that's no longer the case. So this, again, kind of ensures that women who leave welfare roles are going to be working in low-wage areas. Not only are these jobs low-wage, but they also offer few benefits as well. The current welfare reform system, this is the one that was implemented during the Bill Clinton administration and the Newt Gingrich Congress in the 1990s, really reinforces patriarchal family structure, moving us philosophically away from what we believe to be happening in our society, that is, increasing egalitarianism in marital relationships. Such things as family caps for public assistance that denies welfare benefits to children born to mothers who are already recipients, or denying benefits to unmarried teen mothers and their children. As I mentioned earlier, child support enforcement requires mothers to identify fathers and assist in locating them in order to remain eligible for benefits. Even in those situations where it might be harmful to the mother or the children to do so, the mother would lose her benefits if she doesn't fully cooperate. Federal funding through the welfare reform programs also offers incentives to the states to reduce non-marital birth rates without increasing abortions, because they deny funding for those kinds of services. So again, the poor woman in particular is really left without the kind of resources needed to help lift herself up. Senator Lisa Murkowski said some years ago that there was a war on women instituted by the conservative Congress in the early 2000s, and this appears to be continuing today. The focus is very much upon controlling women's reproductive choices and taking advantage of women's weak financial circumstances. The kinds of programs that have been implemented through welfare reform are not supported by statistics. It's not necessary to reduce the welfare rolls, nor do they reduce the number of children on public assistance. They just appear to be outright punitive. And so I would add, particularly for women, a point to be made here is that in a patriarchal society, men are not going to be the ones who are going to initiate change. Even well-meaning men, even men who recognize the inadequacies and nefarious purposes of patriarchy in the social structure, are reluctant to take the necessary action to change that, because the status quo benefits men, benefits the cronies and the system as it exists. The change is going to have to begin with women. Men have to join in that change. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to relieve men and put all the responsibility for change upon women, but women are going to have to lead the way in this fight against sexism and the push to change patriarchal strictures on their lives. Men will need to be responsible to come along with it, but women are going to have to push for change in patriarchy from men. So that's what I think. I hope this is of some use to you, and let me know if I've spurred any thought, and be happy to discuss this in some future get-together. Thank you.